these shows that both Gary and I like watching is, it's getting a bit old now, but it's still running and still being made. It's The Simpsons. And Homer just never gets it, does he? But the episode that I was thinking of when I was preparing today was one where Marge's sister Thelma, it's either Thelma or Selma, gets married to the gangster.
Okay.
Anyway, they go to the wedding, and then they go to the reception, and they're looking desperately for their table. You know, she's the sister and brother-in-law of the bride, and they can't find it. And it's tucked right at the back behind a pillar. Not because of Marge, but because Homer just can't ever behave himself, and they don't want to infuriate him. So sitting at tables and being seated where you feel you should be can often be different to the place where you should be, where you will be. Of course, tables and sitting are a little bit of a subject at ICAC at the moment. $100,000 to sit. What was it, the Prime Minister or the Premier? The Premier. And that, so...
No, the Leader of the Opposition.
Leader of the Opposition.
And the leader, the federal leader of the Opposition.
Okay, so anyway, so the $100,000 table.
Not me.
Today we have another table being thought of in the Gospel. Now, I'm not using this section, but I just wanted, it was interesting to note that when we read that the Pharisees and his enemies were watching him closely, there's rather a nice twist in the Greek that doesn't get picked up in English very well, or at least in our translations. The Greek expression is more that they were lurking in the shadows.
Wow.
Doesn't that give you a certain image? They're lurking in the shadows just waiting. Now, of course, it's a continuation of Sabbath lessons. And we've had last week the healings and the last couple of weeks. And Jesus being accused by the Pharisees of being, you can't be the Son of God, you can't be the Messiah because you keep breaking the Sabbath law. And so here we have this situation today. Has anybody ever thought of Jesus as being comical? Not as in what he does is comic to others, but he uses comedy. No. Okay. Throughout the scriptures, Jesus quite often makes jokes.
I think more tongue-in-cheek.
More tongue-in-cheek puns.
Yes.
But what is it? If you ever listen to a foreign comic, and it's in his name or her name, and it's subtitles, you often think, that's not funny. It doesn't translate, or comedy doesn't translate well.
No.
Okay? Now, let's be clear, Jesus didn't speak English. Neither did the gospel writers. So when they translated it and all that, it just often didn't come across. How often do we hear, oh, I'm sorry, you got it wrong. It was just a joke.
Yes.
In modern day life. It's meant to be ironic. When we miss the irony of a joke and mistake it for a serious statement, we can end up in all sorts of mess. And that's what is at the heart of today's gospel reading. The first part of what Jesus says is a case in point. Now he sees all these guests at this very wealthy person's banquet, jostling for the best positions, all trying to one-up each other. Now at face value, Jesus seems to be offering a bit of advice on how to exploit modesty in order to achieve the goal of socially climbing over everybody else and coming out on top, as I said, on face value. Dispensing strategies to the wealthy and the privileged on how to big note yourself doesn't seem terribly consistent with Jesus' usual style, does it?
No.
Of course not. But fortunately, Luke tips us off. he doesn't introduce the words of Jesus by saying, when he noticed how the guests chose the places of honour, he gave them some successful tips on social climbing skills. Instead, he says, when Jesus noticed how the guests chose the places of honour, he told them a parable. A parable. Now, this is different. Jesus so often tells us parables. He tells us about kings who burned down towns because guests didn't turn up for dinner, about little weed plants that grow into mighty trees, and about wheat fields that yield a 10,000% return. The parables are laden with ironic twists and bizarre, exaggerated details that were never meant to be taken literally. So Jesus is definitely, and I repeat, definitely not handing out strategic social advice here. He's, to use a common parlance, he's really taking the piss out of people. I was seeing what's going on in front of him. But he's not only just doing that. His irony is subverting the goings on in order to make some very, very important points and hopefully set those who are his listeners back on the right track of proper good behaviour. Now, as I've said to you before, how much you get out of parables, indeed out of the scriptures, is how much you're prepared to dig deep. There are often layers of meaning with something for everyone. So never just go to the top layer. Dig down. Now, this parable contrasts two different behaviours at a dinner party. One, jostle for position. Make sure you get up the front. Be seen. The other, but with the danger, of course, of being humiliated when you say, oh, hang on, friend, somebody more important than you is here.
Yes.
Like Hyacinth Bouquet leaving her guests at the kitchen tables when the phone, oh, that'll be somebody important.
Yeah. Yes,
Okay?
that's right.
The second is to park yourself down in the lowest spot, which may result in the host publicly promoting you in the front of others. It's a much better look. But remember, this isn't social advice for 101. It's a parable of the culture of God. Jesus is not advocating sneaky ways of getting you into the celebrity A-list behind the stage passes. In fact, he's poking fun at the shenanigans to illustrate a truth about the emerging culture of God. Those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. Now, this is a frequent theme in Jesus' teaching. Remember, the first will be last, and the last will be first. Those who will be great among you must be servants of all. Even St. Paul says, God chose what is weak in the world to put to shame what is strong. God chose what is base and despised, even things are not, to bring to nothing the things that are. 1 Corinthians. So if you've caught up on this much, you've taken the essential take-home message of Jesus' parable. Perhaps we can dig a little deeper though. We may be able to say that truth, to live out that truth a lot more fully if we get a handle on why it is true and what it looks like in practice, here and now, in the world we live in, rather than first century Palestine. Jesus goes on to give further advice. When you give a lunch or a dinner, and there's a lot of us who are social advice, do not invite your relatives or your friends or your rich people. Invite the poor, the lame, the weak, those who can't return the hospitality. One of the great scholars, New Testament scholars, is Bishop Tom Wright in UK. And he said he once preached on this gospel. and promptly received 3 dinner invitations from members of the congregation. He says he was too nervous to ask which category of outcast they thought he was in. This genuine social advice from Jesus gives us some deeper insights into the practical implications of the parable. So much of human culture, then and now, is driven by what one theologian has called the economy of exchange. We give nothing away without expecting something in return. Life is to be seen as a series of transactions. You play, you pay. You rarely find ourselves receiving gratuitous expressions of love. Instead, we receive down payments in an anticipation of a return. Life is measured. Life is calculated. Life is weighed up. But this is going contrary to the message of this parable. Jesus here urges us, begs us even, to break free of this economy of exchange and embrace rather the economy of God. An economy which is characterized by overflowing generosity, of superabundant love, of extravagant hospitality, and extravagant not in the terms of money, but just open, free and willing. A culture where, as Jesus said elsewhere, we give regardless of merit and without expecting anything in return. So when Jesus asks us to open up our dinner tables to those who do not have the means to repay us, we don't see it, are not to see it just as an act of charity for those who need it, as important as charity is. For Jesus promises that we will be blessed through this ourselves. And it is not just a delayed version of the economy of exchange. Do this now and you'll be paid after you die. The whole notion of rewards in heaven. Jesus throughout the Gospels is constantly telling us that the culture of God is at hand. Right here, right now. If we can break ourselves of the shackles of the economy of exchange, we will be blessed in the here and the now, because we will begin to enjoy the radical freedom of God's culture rather than society's, with its extravagant giving and receiving that is not measured or calculated, targeted or expected in return. As we break ourselves free of targeting our giving to those whom we expect a comparable return, we find ourselves free to receive true love, true generosity, life without measure. So when we begin to hear Jesus' parable and his social advice together, we begin to see and understand the promise of the culture of God more deeply. We can go deeper into this because Jesus' generosity, Jesus' love, Jesus' freedom finds its ultimate expression not at a nice lunch with friends, but on the cross. And that opens up for us an invitation. Not an invitation like we received this morning for a birthday party, but an invitation to join God at the messianic banquet in heaven, the eternal banquet, where nothing but love is our entry. We can find our identity in this parable. Well, not the identity of having to mirror somebody else's who they are because we esteem them and want to mirror them. But we find our own identity as the children of God and as our identity as brothers and sisters of one another. The cross is the ultimate symbol of shame. It was intended by the Romans as not just a means of execution, but a means of public humiliation, of public shaming, so as to terrify the rest of the population into submission. But Jesus wasn't ever willing to forego humiliation in the eyes of others. Remember who he associated with the most during his life. Yes, he was at the feasts of Pharisees, as he was at wedding feasts. But he hung out with the company that those people looked down on. He befriended sex workers, traitors, and sinners, and even eating unclean food at their unclean tables. Jesus' social reputation was awful because he deliberately chose and constantly positioned himself at the bottom of the social table of the day, in the place of scandal, in the place of shame, and the place that those others just wouldn't have been seen dead in. Jesus turned the culture upside down, for that is the culture of God. In a short while we will gather at this table to celebrate the foretaste of the Messianic banquet. It's a table with no places of great honour or lesser. It's a table, it is the table of the crucified and risen Jesus. We hear words of brokenness, and we are fed with signs of humiliation and failure. Here at this table we are being offered our true selves, the body of Christ, so that we can be set free from the status-seeking, ambitious, conniving powers of the world. Free to share our broken selves with others who know themselves as being broken as well. It is at the table of the Lord that we are free to be real, gracious and courageous, to overflow with the love and the scandalous hospitality of the upside down culture of God. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.